Hello, everyone. My name is Cherry Pham. I'm an AmeriCorps member, and I'm serving with Conservation Nebraska's Common Ground program. Conservation Nebraska's mission is to protect our state's natural legacy by educating the public, supporting communities, and increasing civic engagement, which we accomplish through locally led education efforts and community engagement projects to address local conservation concerns, such as what we're going to talk about today. And before I introduce tonight's speaker, I have a few rules to go over. And if you're joining online, keep your cameras off and you'll be muted throughout the whole presentation. And if you have any questions, please type them into the little chat box and we will have a brief time at the end to get those answered for you. For both in-person and online attendees, we will have a very brief survey after the presentation that shouldn't take any longer than 1 to 2 minutes to complete. The survey helps support programming like this one, so we appreciate you taking the time to fill it out. And tonight's speaker is Dr. Michael Hayes. He is a climatologist and also my climate literacy professor, and he was very kind tonight to volunteer and to speak with us. And he has his own guest that he will do an introduction for as well. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Michael Hayes.
Thanks, Cherry. It's a pleasure to have Cherry in my class this semester. Welcome, everybody. This is the classroom that I teach in, so I am kind of familiar with this classroom and with doing Zoom and in-class presentations. It's a hybrid presentation, so it might be a little bit tough, but that's how I do handle my class. Today, I also have Dr. Deborah Bathke here with me, so she will also be involved in the presentation a little bit as well. Dr. Bathke is the new state climatologist for the state of Nebraska. So I'm very happy to have Deborah here. We're going to start by introducing ourselves first a little bit. And the way I wanted to do that is I wanted to tell you that I'm from Michigan originally. And one of the things about Michigan is the Great Lakes state. So water is very important to the state of Michigan. And it was an important part for me growing up as a child in the state of Michigan. And when you're around all that water and you're in the upper Midwest, winter activities were really important for me. So here are a couple of pictures of me with my family doing various winter activities. And that's always been very important to me. It still is important to me. In fact, I try to get out in amongst the water and do hiking as much as I can. And so this gives you a little bit of background of why I do what I do and why I'm really interested in water, Nebraska, natural disasters, and so forth. Deb, do you want to introduce yourself really quickly?
I thought this was later.
No, it's right at the beginning.
Hi, everyone. I'm Deborah Bathke. I am originally from Northeast Nebraska, a small town called Ponca. Has anyone heard of Ponca before or been to the state park there? I like to say this is where I developed was born with my outgoing nature and combined with my love of the environment that kind of set the stage for me being involved in what I do. So this, I'm supposed to stand here. Yeah. Okay. Sorry, I'm feeling like Vanna White. So my path, after graduation, I joined the Air National Guard and then later the Army National Guard. And I worked in public affairs for the National Guard units. And I always include that because that's part of it. I remember being at my training and seeing the hurricane hunters fly and thinking that would be such an awesome thing to do someday before I realized I get terrible motion sickness and that probably wouldn't have actually been an option. I came here to the University of Nebraska for my bachelor's and my master's in meteorology, climatology, and then the master's program was called geosciences. And that was when meteorology, climatology combined with the geology program. From there, I went to the Ohio State University, where I worked in ice core paleoclimatology at the Bird Polar Research Center and worked on ice cores, cutting them up and analyzing them in the lab for particles of dust. I didn't do the chemistry part, but I did the dust analysis and trying to relate that to the period of record meteorological observations that we had for the region to try and understand what has happened with the Earth's climate through time. My first job after that was New Mexico State University. Not really any ice in southern New Mexico, but when I started there, New Mexico and well, much of the West was in the midst of a really bad drought, and so my attention shifted quickly from precipitation variability as it's recorded in ice cores to just the lack of precipitation and how that was impacting New Mexico. I like to tell my husband I spent my whole life trying to get out of Nebraska, and then where is his job? In Nebraska. So I ended up moving back home to Nebraska, and I have been back in Nebraska for, let's see, 16, 17 years, 16, going on my 17th year back at the university. I taught in Earth and Atmospheric Sciences. I taught here in the School of Natural Resources. I worked full-time with the National Drought Mitigation Center when Mike was the director there. And then in December of last year, so almost a year ago, I was doing the state climatologist gig part-time and then full-time since July. So that's how I got, and to how I got here tonight is I volunteered to help Mike.
Yes, I really appreciate that. So if I could have photoshopped Deborah's picture into this picture, I would have, because as Deborah mentioned, we've both worked with the National Drought Mitigation Center. And so we've spent a good chunk of our career chasing droughts. And so I like to view this as my chasing drought photo up here. And when you put Deborah and I together, we have about 40 years of drought chasing experience with the National Drought Mitigation Center. So, and chasing something, when you think about chasing something in the Midwest, most people think about chasing storms, right? Chasing tornadoes. Well, Deborah's got some experience with that because her husband's one of the premier storm chasers.
And accidentally seeing tornadoes driving home from the airport during that big outbreak in
April. Yep. So, so tornado chasing, people think about tornado chasing. This was a photo that one of my students took last year during, well, he was on his way home, but he was in my class that particular semester. So you think about that. One of the reasons why you think about that is because storm chasing is really popular in the movies, right? So how many of you have seen Twister 2? Just Deborah. Oh, good. And the 10-11 person. So great. So I haven't seen that.
You haven't seen it?
No, I haven't seen Twister 2. So but it's not the only chasing movie that's out there. I don't know if you guys are aware of the movie Chasing Ice. So it's a movie about a person who goes around and is looking at how ice is disappearing around the world. It's really actually an amazing documentary. And so there's Chasing Ice. And then there's another documentary, Chasing Coral, where looking at how corals disappearing around the world. So another documentary. And you might think, well, that's gotta be it about chasing things. No, there's actually Chasing Water. Excellent documentary. This guy travels the Colorado River from the source to the mouth, and it's a fascinating documentary as well. This got me thinking though. Okay, there's got to be a documentary we can put together on chasing drought. So chasing drought. Where will it strike next? Starring UNL faculty and staff and students. So yeah, drought chasing. But Deborah and I have moved on. Neither of us are any longer with the National Drought Mitigation Center. So we are actually chasing climate now rather than just chasing drought. And if you think about that, we have more than 50 years experience of climate chasing between Deborah and I. In fact, I think 57, maybe if you do the math correctly based on what you said. So yeah, so this talk is more about climate. And am I okay hitting that? Okay. So this is about natural disasters, and I wanted to highlight a couple of things. So we've had some very noticeable disasters recently, and at the end of October, there was this flood event that happened in Spain. And here's a picture of some of the damage that occurred. A very unusual event that happened that created these tremendous floods. Over 200 people were killed in one small part of Spain. Very unusual there. But we also had a flood that was really similar to that in Libya just last year. So these floods are happening, and this is one example of that. And in the US, we've had recent disasters such as Hurricane Milton. So Hurricane Milton hit Florida. This is a picture of the damage done to the baseball stadium in Tampa. The damage is so bad to that stadium that they won't even be able to play baseball in 2025 in the stadium. So they'll have to find someplace else to play their baseball games. I think they're going to do it at the Yankee Stadium for spring training in 2025. So that was Hurricane Milton. And then Hurricane Helene was a week or two earlier than Milton. It hit Florida as well, but then spun up into North Carolina and created these incredible flash flood events or flood events in Western North Carolina with the hills and the valleys there. These are some iconic pictures from the flooding of a lake with all the debris that was captured by the lake as a result of the flooding events.
I just read that they calculated that as a 1 in 1,000 year.
Yeah, or maybe even 1 in 3,000 years, something like that, event happening. So it's really kind of focused some attention on what's going on with hurricanes, what's going on with flooding, just as the other events have been as well. There's some really interesting before and after photos of the flooding in North Carolina. If you go onto the internet, so this is just one example with the before picture on the left, and then the after picture at about the same spot on the right. And there's just a lot of really incredible stories about that. I heard that Asheville just got their water back like within this last week. So yeah, big impacts happening as a result of Hurricane Milton. And still going on is the current drought that we're facing in the United States. Drought might not be quite as visually stunning as Hurricane Milton or Hurricane Helene, right? Or the floods in Spain, but it's still causing a big issue across the United States. This is the most recent U.S. Drought Monitor map for the U.S. The U.S. Drought Monitor product comes out once a week on every Thursday. So there'll be another version of the U.S. Drought Monitor released tomorrow morning. And it's showing general drought conditions across the U.S. The darker the shade of color, the more severe the drought is in that location. And what's really interesting is with the yellow, orange, and red colors, all 50 states across the country have some type of dryness or drought that's going on right now in the US. So that's pretty amazing. Even Alaska has some dryness in the panhandle of Alaska. And so there's a lot of drought. You can see what's happening in the central US. The northeastern United States has quite a bit of drought, and they've been in the news recently because of wildfires. Wildfires that are just outside of New York City, and they're still experiencing wildfires. This has gone on for probably about the last 2 weeks or so in New York or in the Northeast. One of the ways this map works is There are 4 agencies involved, including the National Drought Mitigation Center here at the University of Nebraska. But there's also a network of 450 local experts around the country who help provide feedback to the authors of this map each week. So a draft is prepared. The experts around the country provide feedback about what's going on in their location, because it might be tough for someone in Lincoln, Nebraska to know what's going on in Maine or in Arizona. And so that feedback comes in, and it's that iterative process that helps make this map as accurate as possible. That's really important because a lot of decisions are being made based off of this product. One of the things you can do with this product is you can drill down geographically and highlight a region like the high plains of the US. Or you can highlight the state of Nebraska. And this is the current drought situation across Nebraska. A lot of D2 and some areas of D3 drought in the northeast part of the state and in the panhandle, northwest panhandle right now. And all of these things you can get on the US Drought Monitor website. So this website is hosted here by the National Drought Mitigation Center in Hardin Hall, here in the School of Natural Resources. And that toolbar at the top has a lot of different tools that you can use in order to get more information about the drought conditions that are occurring around the US. So it's a really excellent resource for drought-related conditions in the United States. For example, you can go in and you can get a time series of droughts. This is a time series of drought across the entire continental US from 2000 on the left to the present time on the right, last week's map, for example. One of the things I tell my students is every time series tells an important story. So this time series is telling the story of drought for the last 25 years across the United States. And you can see during that 25-year period, there's no time in which dryness or drought isn't occurring somewhere in the United States. Isn't that pretty amazing? So the United States is big enough that we have drought occurring somewhere in the United States every single week going back to 2000. You can see some of the big droughts that are occurring. What's really interesting is I mentioned this recent dryness. This past week, 83% of the US, more than 83%, was in some kind of dryness or drought. A couple weeks ago, it was at 87%. That's more than any week prior, going all the way back to 2000. So currently, right now, we have more area in dryness or drought than we've had in the US going back to 2000. So it really illustrates how dry this fall has been across most of the United States, in spite of Hurricane Milton, in spite of Hurricane Helene, right? We're still having this incredible dryness. The past couple of weeks, we've gotten some moisture, very welcome, particularly here in Lincoln, right? So maybe these things will be easing up a little bit as we head into the winter. We can always also get a time series of the drought situation in Nebraska. So this is Nebraska drought from 2000 to the present. And boy, you can really see the major droughts that affected Nebraska stand out. 2002 and 2003, big drought years. 2012 and 2013 were big drought years in Nebraska. 2022, 2023, also big drought years. And then quite a bit of drought right at the end. Maybe not as severe as some of the other droughts have been yet, but covering quite a bit of the state. Again, you can get this type of time series for any geographical representation around the United States, Lancaster County, tribes in Northeast Nebraska. You can get these time series. Why is that important? Because USDA uses the information on the US Drought Monitor map to provide drought relief to agricultural producers. In fact, billions of dollars of drought relief from USDA to agricultural producers is determined by the US Drought Monitor map. So it's a very important product. And so that's why it's very difficult for the authors working on the Drought Monitor to make sure they get the depiction of that correct.
You should mention that both of us used to be authors.
Yeah, both of us have been authors on the US Drought Monitor map. Yeah, question.
Yeah, I was just, so looking at that map, it looks like it's roughly every 10 years for a major drought. Is that normal? Or do you only have data back to 2000?
We don't, for the Drought Monitor, the product started in 2000, so we
Okay.
only have that going back to 2000. So I would say that drought is a regular feature, but it's not necessarily a cyclical thing where we can regularly depend on when it's going to occur or not occur.
Okay.
Yep. Thanks. All right, now I want to put drought in perspective with other natural disasters. And so this graphic here kind of breaks down natural disasters into 4 different types. So drought is on the far right under the climatological events, along with extreme temperatures, wildfire. Then hydrological events, flooding, landslides, meteorological events, which includes tropical storms and tornadoes. And then geophysical events on the left, earthquakes and volcanoes. And this categorization is going to be important in a couple of slides. So when I get to that point, kind of remember how this breaks down. We also track natural disasters here in the US through the agency, the National Centers for Environmental Information, NCEI. They're an organization or an agency within NOAA, and they keep track of the billion-dollar disasters that have occurred in the United States, billion-dollar disaster events from 1980 here on the left to the present in 2024 on the right. And so again, a time series, it tells a story of what's happening. Each of the gradations is an event. So the number of events is on the y-axis on the left. The amount of money lost in total in billions of dollars is on the right y-axis. And you can see the different types of events that have occurred in each year from 1980. Overall, the story is telling us that the number of billion-dollar events in the United States is increasing with time, right? In 2023, we had $28 billion disaster events. The green color, the dark green, those are severe storms. They're certainly getting to be more common with time. The blue are floods. The yellow are tropical cyclones. And so you can see costs are also rising with time. The interesting aspect about the costs is they are all standardized to the same year. I forget which year, but so all the costs are comparing apples to apples when you look at this graphic. This website, this billion-dollar disaster website, is a great website to go in and look at lots of information. And one of the things they do on their website is they also look at social vulnerability. And so this website does a great job of connecting natural disaster events with some of the social vulnerabilities that we experience in this country. So you can go in to this website and you can understand how education might be overlapped with losses to natural disasters and some of the other social economic vulnerabilities. The reason why I raise this and point this out is I think we need to, as a society, start to think about how are natural disasters affecting justice-related issues? And are there things we need to do for people who have lesser socioeconomic status? And are they being impacted more by these natural disasters? I'm going to explore that a little bit more here with these next couple of slides. I'm going to go look at global information first. So This next slide, the graph coming up, are the number of disaster events globally that have happened between 1980 and 2019. And these events are organized in those same categories that I showed you a couple of slides earlier. So what you see is in the top line, that's the total number of disaster loss events that have happened in that 40-year period. So in 1980, that was around 250. By 2019, that number is in the 750 or 800 range. So the number of these disaster loss events have been increasing, mainly because of the hydrological and the meteorological events that have been increasing over time. This data is put together by Munich Re. Anybody know who Munich Re is? Deborah does. It's a reinsurance company. So they're the insurance company for the insurance company. All right. So this data is really important to them because they're the ones that are experiencing the losses from these natural disaster events. So they keep very good track of this type of information. So this is really good data that they have put together at Munich Re. This graph shows the number of deaths from natural disasters around the world, globally, from 1900 to 2017. So the story with this time series is deaths seem to be decreasing. So previous graph showed that the events seem to be increasing, right, with time, but deaths seem to be decreasing with time. Why do you think that is?
Better systems to alert people.
Excellent, yeah. Better education, better technology, better alert systems. We know more about these storms. We're much more aware and alert about them. Some of the death totals back in the early 1900s, plus 3 million people, 3.5 million people in some of those years. Now in more recent years, 500,000, 250,000, and so forth. Here's another graph of the same thing, global deaths from 1900 to 2020 on the right, broken down by individual disaster. So all disasters are at the top: droughts, floods, earthquakes, volcanoes, storms, extreme temperature, landslides, wildfires, and the size of the circle, the number of deaths in that particular event. So in the early 1900s, you can see 3.7 million deaths in China in 1931, 3 million deaths in China in drought in 1928. So droughts, you can see we tend to be having less deaths in droughts. Floods are kind of a regular pattern, but you're not having those big flood events with a lot of deaths. Earthquakes tend to be going around regularly, right? Volcanoes, kind of a regular pattern. Storms. Look at extreme temperature though. It seems like it's picking up in terms of time. And that makes sense to us. Heat waves are probably becoming more of an issue as we go forward in time. The 2003 event in Europe, and then the 2010 heat wave show up very prominently when you look at extreme temperatures. This graph here just breaks it down by decade, 1970 to 2010, 2019. Deaths or fatalities from natural disasters are decreasing on a global scale. But just to emphasize that previous point, that tan color is extreme temperature. That seems to be like it's becoming more prominent with time. Again, this probably makes sense. Finally, with this table, global disaster data, cumulative 2000 to 2020, the different disasters here in the first column, from drought to heat wave and total. Look at that number for drought, in that first column of data. The number of people impacted cumulatively from 2000 to 2020, 1.4 billion people have been cumulatively affected by drought between 2000 and 2020. More than any of the other disasters, floods, 1.2 billion, and so forth. All right. You look at the number of deaths, tropical cyclone has the most deaths globally during that 20-year period. The number of events, flooding has the most events. That kind of makes sense for us. If you go to the very last column, 1,000 deaths per event. What is that? It's our heat waves. Our heat waves are having the biggest amount of fatality per event during that 20-year period. Again, it gets back to heat waves. And again, that probably makes some sense when you think about what's happening. Economic disaster by disaster type. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but the time series tells a story. You see the various different types of events broken out. This data is not standardized by year, all right? So these losses are 1980 losses, these losses are 2000 losses, 2024 losses. So that's why we have this next graph. This standardizes the data to 2024 dollars. And so our economic losses to natural disasters in the US are increasing with time. That's the story of that time series. All right, so let's get back to my question about disasters and justice. So I'm going to wrap up here with a couple of slides. To me, justice is about making right what is unjust for the weak, orphaned, oppressed, lonely, etc. That's kind of a general definition of justice. I really like the idea of biblical justice expressed in Micah 6:8. What does the Lord require of you but to do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with our God? So to me, that's a definite call to action for those of us in a position like I'm in. And then climate justice recognizes that the disproportionate impacts of extreme events are on low-income communities, communities of color around the world, and the people and places that are least responsible for some of these issues. So here's a chart. Number of disasters for a 20-year period from 1994 to 2013 by income level. And what you'll notice is that each income level is about equally represented. So each income level has the same number of natural disasters, roughly. But when you look at deaths per income group, it's the lower income groups that are experiencing 68% of the deaths from natural disasters. To me, that's a justice-related issue. All right. You look at deaths per million inhabitants, and it really stands out that the lowest income group has the highest number of deaths per million inhabitants. So for me, that's a justice-related issue. Economic losses. Well, economic losses, it's the higher income groups that are experiencing 90% of the losses. Well, that makes sense, right? We're the ones that have the stuff. So we're experiencing the economic losses. But that's not the whole story, all right? Here's the story. When you break it down between economic losses in blue, high income have the high economic losses compared to the low income in blue. But the orange bars are economic losses per GDP, or based as a percent of GDP. Only 0.3% for the high income, 5.1% for the low income. So even though they're not losing a lot of economic value, it still has a high economic impact on the lowest income groups. To me, that's a justice issue. So before I turn it over to Deb, here are a couple questions to consider. Are climate and natural disasters linked? I would say some of the stories from some of those time series I showed would illustrate that climate and natural disasters are linked. Are natural disasters and justice linked? Some of the graphics I just showed, I would say would make the argument that they are linked. And so if they are linked, are climate and justice linked through natural disasters? And if they are, we really need to be thinking about how are we handling natural disasters here in the US and around the world. All right, that's my part of the story tonight. What we'll do is we're going to talk about what's next, and Deborah's going to come up for just a couple of minutes as we wrap up this evening. One of the things that is happening is on a global scale, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change puts out reports, and they've done it at roughly or quasi-regular pattern from 1990 to 2023, 6 reports on climate change. At the national level, the National Climate Assessment has put out quasi-regular reports. They've put out 5 of them since 2000, the last one in 2023. And so Nebraska had 2 reports, one in 2014, one in 2015. Deborah was involved with those. The state's now working on a state climate report that'll come out either later this year or in early 2025. And Deborah's going to talk to you more about that. So Deborah.
So the climate report that I'm frantically working on up until I came down here was authorized by our state legislature through LB 1255 that said that the University of Nebraska Institute of Agricultural and Natural Resources will develop an independent, I read the wrong part, will update the climate change report in 2014. What's different from the 2014 report is this part that I put the box around that says that in addition to just talking about the climate and assessing the impacts, there will be a component that is done by a third-party consulting firm that makes recommendations for the state, for communities, even for individuals, of things that communities or people can do to increase sustainability, to adapt to respond to be better prepared for some of what will be coming ahead with climate change. So that's one of the new parts that we will see in this upcoming report. Our goal for this report, since I've been through this one time, actually I've been through this twice. I was involved in a report in New Mexico as well. So this is my 3rd time on a state climate report. So I've learned a lot since that first time. The goal of our report this time is to understand Nebraska's climate vulnerability and to produce something that supports decision-making and something that can inform state policies, plans, and programs to promote action and build resilience to climate impacts. So how many people read in the paper, saw on the news, the $307 million grant that Nebraska Department, is it Energy and Environment or Environment and Energy? I never remember which way. So in their plan of action, they have identified using this upcoming report to help them guide some of what they do with the money that they received. And I still get requests for their 2014 report. So I think it's something that people will use and will talk about for a number of years. So one of my goals this time is I wanted this report to be the voice of the state's climate expertise. I did not want it to be the report that Deb wrote on climate change. I wanted to really draw from that expertise. There are so many faculty, even though like in terms of the meteorology, climatology, or applied climate sciences, there are a number of faculty, but there's so many more faculty that have expertise in various aspects of climate change. And this is where I point out, I should call you doctor. Doctor.
No, actually, I'm not a doctor. You can call me
Professor Dana Fritz, who is in Fine Arts.
Yeah,
Is
School
that-
of Art, History, and Design.
School of Art, History, and Design, and she works in communicating climate change through art. You can correct me, or you'll find that if you want to. So that's just an example, and we have expertise in people who communicate through other visual ways, and people who focus on agriculture and climate change, and water and climate change. And I'll show you the whole list here in a minute. So I really wanted to use this opportunity of this report to highlight and draw upon the experience from those of us not only here at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln, but also the Medical Center in Omaha and even Creighton University. One thing that I did different this time than the last time, when I first took over doing this report almost a year ago, was to immediately set, well, the first thing I did was panic and go to Mike's office, which is right down the hall for me. But after that, I decided to set up an advisory board to have, and it consists mostly of chairs and directors. Mike, who's a former director, but I think are you technically the head of the Applied Climate Sciences Division, basically?
Sure.
But we also have Dave Aiken from Ag Econ, Mary Emery, the Director of Rural Prosperity, Margaret Jacobs, the Director of the Center for Great Plains Study, Rizul Mahmood from High Plains Regional Climate Center, Peter McCormick from the Darty Water for Food Global Institute. We never call it by that full name. Larkin Powell, our director here in SNR, Crystal Powers, who's our liaison to Extension, Chittaram Ray, the director of the Water Center, Clint Rowe, the department chair for Earth and Atmospheric Sciences, Mark Svoboda, the director of the Drought Center, and Brian Wardlow, the director of the Center for Agriculture, Land Management,
Information technology.
Information Technology, or CalMet. So many acronyms. It's like the alphabet soup. So I think this has been a really important addition to the report this year, to be able to draw upon their expertise, to have them answer questions, give advice on how we communicate this, how we navigate the political climate that we're in these days with the report, and just various aspects, how we present information. And it helps spread the love of the climate action. So all together, when we look at it for this upcoming climate report, is we have 18 authors who did most of the writing from 4 college university campuses. We have a 12-member advisory group. We have a review team consisting of people who were not involved in the writing of the report. So some of those are from UNL, some of those are from other universities, including Clemson, University of Wisconsin. I can't remember the other universities. Some of them work for federal agencies. So multiple people have looked at each chapter. And that was important to me because that's how we do science. Part of science is that review of work. It's peer review. And that's what we included this time. All together, we have this list of, and I don't know where I put my drink because my mouth is going really dry. We have 25 programs within the University of Nebraska system, at least. I probably missed a couple. And then also Creighton as well. So it really is the voice of the climate expertise, or maybe it's more like the chorus, because we all have our own unique part, but we come together to share a common message. This is an overview of what the report looks like. So we have obviously an overview, and then we started out with putting climate change, talking about the global and the national context, because what happens here in Nebraska depends on what happens in other places in the globe, some of the impacts that we feel. When Mike talked about Hurricane Helene, one of the impacts from Hurricane Helene was that the company that supplies 60% of the IV fluids was located in North Carolina. So elective surgeries across the country were put on hold. Guard members and reserve members from Nebraska were activated to respond to that. So we talk about that bigger context. And then we talk about specific changes just in Nebraska climate, using some more localized data and analysis that we have done at the High Plains Regional Climate Center, the National Drought Mitigation Center, and the State Climate Office. That's something that's new from the last report. The last report in 2014, we relied solely on the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports, and the National Climate Assessment, pulling things out and highlighting things for Nebraska. In this upcoming report, we've done some of our own analysis for the observed trends, and then also for the future projections that use global climate models. And those are roughly, I think the last report, the resolution of those were roughly, I'm gonna get it wrong, I think 40 square miles maybe, or bigger. And one of the faculty members in Earth and Atmospheric Science did some downscaling so that we now have it at a 4-mile resolution for Nebraska. So that's the more local information that is needed for decision making or to put into other climate models, whether it's a hydrologic model or an economic model or an agricultural model. We have a chapter on groundwater that was written, and I need to update my slide. It's not just groundwater anymore, it's ground and surface water, written by the Water Center and the Conservation and Survey District here on campus. A chapter on energy that's written by an energy extension specialist. Ecosystems from the Nebraska Fish and Wildlife Co-op unit, so it's a USGS cooperative unit that's housed here. On agriculture, written by faculty in agronomy and horticulture. Communities in the built environment, written by faculty member in community and regional planning. Rural communities, just a focus on rural communities, written by a sociologist for the National Drought Mitigation Center. Indigenous communities, written by, and I forgot that on my other slide, on Indigenous communities, written by a faculty member from the Nebraska Indian Community College. The health component, written by faculty at the Med Center, and then a climate justice and equity. So what Mike was just talking about, written by a faculty member at Creighton. So those sections that are new this time are the Indigenous communities, the climate justice and equity. I think those are the two new sections that we didn't have in the last report. And then something else that's new is we have some chapters that look at the perceptions and attitudes of people in the US and Nebraska towards climate change and climate action, and also how the faith community and leaders in the faith community can be involved in advocating for action. And that section was written by a faculty member at Creighton as well. And then, once all of this is done, we're getting so close. Then the third-party consulting firm, which is a company that's based out of Minnesota, that they wrote the climate action plan for Omaha. So they are familiar with Nebraska, having gone through that process. And I forgot to include that Dana and other artists will be providing photographs and things to work in throughout the report to help tell the story. Oops. So, I probably should have had this earlier, but the reason why the report is important, it's required by the legislature. Will be used to support the NDEE $307 million grant. So, by the way, they got $307 million for their programs. We got $150,000. Omaha got $3 million for their climate action plan. We got $150,000. So we're making it work. This report will be highly visible. I've already had media inquiries about it, and we're telling them, not until we get it submitted. We're not going to talk about the results and the findings until it's submitted. I think another important outcome is that it really helps bring together and make a community of the people who are doing climate change research. At least I think it has. You know, that we have regular calls to talk about the report and issues and things that come up and how to talk about climate change. And because scientists aren't really well known for their ability to communicate science. So that's why it's important that we have folks that specialize in communication to work with us and help us really get the message out. And then finally, it will identify gaps and opportunities for the state of Nebraska. What are some things that we just don't know yet that the scientists need to take a closer look at and do more analysis on? So that's about the report. Am I out of time? Sorry, I talked longer than I thought I would.
Do you want us to wrap up pretty quick if you want for questions or something?
How many slides do you have left? 2. Oh, you're probably fine.
Yeah. So some other efforts that are going on within the state climate office. My colleague, Dr. Eric Hunt, is involved with weather-ready farms for Nebraska. We have the Nebraska Mesonet, has a brand new website with some new information. We're in the process of deploying new stations. I think there's a goal for 20 more, or at least 20 more in 2025, 20 to 30 more stations to increase the density. And then some grants. One's called Rural Confluence that focuses on climate resiliency in rural communities. And then our Community Climate Resilience Institute, which did not get funded, but we still talk about climate and still meet. And both Dana and Mike were involved in that effort. We have students working on these various projects, and I just like to highlight the students and some of the great work that they do. We paid 2 students from the community of Niobrara. They don't go to UNL. One goes to Northeast Community College, the other goes to University of South Dakota, to work in their community. And one of the things that they did, Niobrara has been moved twice because of flooding. One of the things that they did is, when we were talking about climate and the town moving and the disaster funding, is when they were applying for relief funding, they were asking what things looked like before the flood. And so they were having to go back to people's photo albums and phones to see if someone had it in the background. So these students did a photo inventory of community assets so that they would have those ready to go for the next time that it flooded. They held a workshop and got different experts, grant writers, and people in charge of different grant programs to come meet with community members and leaders to help fund projects. The students themselves actually wrote 2 grants, and they both got funded. One was for trees, one was for weather stations. And I think most importantly, it helped them see a future in Niobrara for themselves too, by being able to work and give back in the community. So that's something that we're hoping to expand in the future. These are quotes from the students. We have a couple who work here in Hardin Hall. One's a grad student, one's an undergrad. Jerome is actually Mike's graduate student, and his interest is where does the traditional ecological knowledge intersect with Western science? And I love how he says it's where my heart beats, like that's what's important to him. Cam is actually a fisheries and wildlife major who's probably gonna go to law school, but she loves working on climate things, and she says she gets to help out in a lot of different areas for something that she's passionate about. Very crucial part of our team. And then we also have someone working on an undergraduate student at Creighton working on climate justice issues. So we pay her to work with a faculty member there. We recently have, was it just this year we hired someone in environmental justice at UNO? I don't remember when he came. But so her interest is how do we understand, how do we communicate about climate change, and how does that, how do their personal history and culture feed into that? And that's all that I have. So I know I can't.
Survey is in the upper right for those of you that would like to go in and do the survey and use your phone for that.
And
We also have paper, if you guys prefer paper.
I didn't bring my phone, so. Okay.
They're very short, just 4 questions.
Maybe that helps you, right?
And if you have questions, we're happy to take those.
You
Sure.
want them to?
Yeah.
It's okay.
You want pens?
So I was wondering, is there anything in the report that, I mean, obviously the climate change is caused by atmospheric CO2, right? Or is it true? Is it not true? Is the carbon dioxide level increase, right? So
Yes,
it keeps dropping, right? So we have,
it's a contributing factor.
it's a big contributor, assume, right?
Yes.
So in Nebraska, we have agricultural land, right? And we over 150 years lost 3/4 of total carbon that is in the atmosphere, right? It's still there. And we have a way to pull it by, farming correctly. Is there anything, maybe not in your report, but a recommendation that goes that way? Because that seems to be like a low hanging fruit.
I think that.
I understand that you're kind of trying to armor all this effects of
Mhm.
what we've been suffering through, right?
So that, from my understanding in my conversations with NDEE, is part of the focus of their work and their $307 million that they got is doing some carbon accounting for carbon and carbon capture.
And they're gonna focus on
And they're
agriculture.
focusing on agriculture.
And I'm not talking about carbon dioxide pipelines, which to me is,
Right,
it's questionable in terms of energy.
right.
But I'm very interested and I follow regenerative farming.
Mhm.
And there is a very good, data showing that you can actually sequester carbon. And we had 8% roughly, 150 is 8% of organic matter. We had two. Another thing that is going to, eventually kind of break the agriculture if we keep doing what we're doing. But you can reverse it within 10 years. There's a lot of work done, but it's, my legislature to be good, that needs to be expanded in my opinion. I mean, Nebraska is one of them, Iowa, we have a lot of,
So part of the reason that Nebraska got the NDEE funding was because of the focus on ag and to implement some pilot projects that, and I don't know all the specifics of it, but to implement some pilot projects. And I think carbon accounting, have you read it? I've been so focused on the other report that I forget what was in theirs. So, that's some of what they will be looking at.
And I would just add, UNL has some really good researchers looking at some of the different aspects of
Yes.
this type of topic. Yeah. Mhm.
Yep.
Other questions? Yeah, Dina.
Why was it almost 10 years between climate assessment reports?
You're in Nebraska?
Yeah.
I have no idea.
Well, I think just, getting the funding for it takes a while, so getting the legislature to act upon that, I think, has been one of the reasons why that time.
It just seems like as things are accelerating, that's a very long gap.
I'm hoping that this version of the report, so by the end of the year, I have to have an electronic version of the report in. I'm hoping to build it out into, well, I'm planning to build it out into a website. And hopefully it will be more of a living document or a living website that we can, as we find more information, that we can get those resources included. I'm also hoping that we can involve graduate students as part of a class to help us get things updated too. I don't want it to be 10 years again. So ideally it would be 5 for like a full overhaul update following the National Climate Assessment. That's what a lot of states do who do these assessments. So
On a couple of things. So it's good to know that's gonna be available, because I think it's really important for people to know what they can do and what communities can do. And, what else was I gonna say? I just think you guys have such a wealth of information and knowledge. That's wonderful. But I just think the communication part in our current political climate, I just find it pretty scary that up there are people that don't even think anything's going on. I think this is all just craziness. And it's pretty scary when you have, I mean, I just look at all that data and I think, wow, that's incredible. It's pretty hard to deny to me, but there are people out there, and there are people out there that I run into who are skeptical of the university, just in general. They don't believe people at the university. They think, I don't know what they think. They think there's a huge conspiracy or something out there. And it's pretty frightening. So I just wondered if you guys have any thoughts about that and what we can do as individuals.
I think part of that, why you're looking at me because you totally want me to hit this.
And you started talking.
That's why we're engaging communication experts this time to help us tell the story. I forgot to mention another part of our rural communities project. That one of the things the students did is they did interviews about climate change and how their community has come together to build resilience for these extreme events. And so we're hoping to expand upon that and have those be on a website across the state so that you can click on and listen to those different stories. So we're hoping to up that storytelling and personal experience component of it as well, and photographs in there too. So
One of the reasons why I like the project that Deborah talked about is you have 2 local Niobrara students going back to Niobrara and working with the citizens
Yeah.
there. That's what we need to do. I'm involved in a project where I'm working with college students who are then mentors for high school students across Nebraska. So that kind of transfer of knowledge, I think, is really helpful and can make a difference. We've just gotta be patient and persistent, I think, in how we talk about these issues.
and like Mike said, having the local students, like Niobrara is a community of 300. The people in that community have known these girls since they were little. And so when they ask them for an interview at their, annual community days, if I would have asked them, they probably would have just walked right past me. But when it's someone, they were more likely to engage with these students who were from that area. And when we first went in to talk to them, and we started building a timeline of extreme events, and they were kind of skeptical of us coming in from the university. But once we hired their students and their students got involved in the project and were doing action and, you know, getting involved, we really saw a change in the community's behavior and or attitude towards us. And one of the things I want to do once the report is done is to go around the state and have community conversations about the report and about climate. And Niobrara wants to be the first one because they've been working with us on these climate change issues. So I promise them they get to be first for the community conversations because they've been working with us for the past year. So.
I do have 2 questions online.
Sure.
Okay, so the first one is, how is drought determined? Is it by soil moisture or amount of rain and snow? A 10-inch
Yes.
rain after a severe drought will do little to increase soil moisture, as all that rain won't soak in.
You can take that.
So that's a great question. Drought is really all of those things. So it depends how you use water and where you are in the local context. But when I talk about drought, I try to get people to think about the hydrologic cycle, which goes from precipitation to runoff, to stream flow, to groundwater, to evaporation, evapotranspiration. All those things are involved in drought, and drought can have an impact on each one of those things. So heat increases evapotranspiration. If you don't have snowpack, you're not going to have runoff and reservoir levels. So drought can have an influence on each one of those aspects. So we've got to monitor all of it.
That makes sense. Thank you. And then the one other question is, what do you have to say about the concept of corn sweat? And thank you for presenting.
Thank you. So corn sweat, it's evapotranspiration, really. And so when you've got a lot of evapotranspiration happening, it's definitely going to increase the amount of moisture within the atmosphere. And so that has an impact. And so, yes, in an area where it's dry and you don't have a lot of vegetation, you're not going to have a lot of evapotranspiration. So, yeah, it's definitely happening. When you combine heat with humidity, we go by the heat index. You know, people hear about the heat index. That's a measure of the combination of those two. So that's another aspect of it.
And you can see and some of our trend plots and perhaps that will be in the report, you can see the effect of irrigated agriculture in our trend data.
And I did actually just have one more question come in, which is a good closing question, I think.
Sure.
It says, what's the best way for the average citizen to keep up to date on the science behind global warming? It's a big question. That's a good question.
That is a good question. So, these reports that we mentioned, so the National Climate Assessment is a great report that comes out. There's a lot of information that goes into that. It's on the web, so it'd be the 5th National Climate Assessment. It's the most recent one. There are other trusted entities that collect a lot of this type of information. So I would just make sure you're watching those and reading about those and yeah. So
Yeah.
Eventually, we hope to have those resources on the Nebraska State Climate Office website.
right.
Not immediately, but
And I'm sure as soon as I leave this room, more will come to my mind. Why didn't I suggest that one? But there are a lot of good resources
out there. You can always email either Mike or I if you wanted some specific examples.
Yes.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.